This is not just the story of what happened in August 1945. This is the story of what didn't happen, and how one decision to exercise restraint established precedents that have shaped nuclear history for 8 decades. This is the story of the weapon we chose not to use. Tinian Island, Northern Marianas, August 17, 1945, 0430 hours. Major Charles Sweeney checked his watch in the pre-dawn darkness. In 6 hours, he would pilot the B-29 carrying the third atomic bomb toward Tokyo. He had flown the Nagasaki mission 8 days earlier. He had piloted Boxcar through flak and fighter intercepts to deliver Fat Man over the city. He had executed the sharp diving turn immediately after release, racing to escape the blast radius. He had seen the flash in his rear mirror, bright enough to leave after images. He had felt the shockwave hit his aircraft 11 miles away, rattling every rivet. Later, he saw the reconnaissance photographs. The mushroom cloud rising 60,000 feet, the city's center obliterated, the Urakami Valley scorched black. Casualty estimates, 40,000 immediate deaths, perhaps 70,000 by year's end. Now Tokyo, the capital, 3 million people. The Imperial Palace, government buildings, residential districts, women, children, families going about their lives, unaware that 13 pounds of plutonium sat in a bomb bay on Tinian Island with their city's coordinates programmed into a bomb site. Japan had broadcast Emperor Hirohito's willingness to surrender yesterday, but the surrender wasn't official yet, wasn't signed. Military hardliners were attempting a coup at that very moment to prevent it. Radio intercepts from Tokyo spoke of gunfire near the Imperial Palace, of officers refusing to accept the emperor's decision. The third bomb, the F-31 plutonium core, sat assembled in the weapons bay of his B-29, tail number 77. The same basic design as Fat Man, 500 pounds of conventional high explosives surrounding the plutonium core in a precise implosion lens configuration. Yield estimated at 21 kilotons, enough to obliterate 4 square miles of central Tokyo. The mission briefing was scheduled for 0500 hours. Takeoff at 10 o'clock. Bomb drop over Tokyo at approximately 2:30 p.m. local time. Weather forecast, clear skies, excellent visibility. No excuses for missing the target this time. Sweeney walked across the tarmac toward the operations building. His crew was already gathering: bombardier, navigator, flight engineer, radio operator, gunners. Young men, most barely into their 20s. They stood in small groups, smoking cigarettes, not talking much. No one made eye contact. The usual pre-mission banter was absent. They had all seen the Nagasaki reconnaissance photos. They knew what they were about to do. At 0515 hours, the operations phone rang. The duty officer picked it up, listened. His face went blank, expressionless, carefully controlled. He listened for another 30 seconds without speaking. Then, understood, will comply immediately. He hung up the phone, turned to face the assembled crew. The room went completely silent. Mission canceled. Stand down. Return the F-31 core to secure storage for transport to Los Alamos. No further atomic missions authorized without direct presidential order. The room exhaled collectively. No cheers, no celebration. Just a profound, visceral relief that swept through the assembled men like a physical force. Sweeney felt his shoulders drop, tension he hadn't fully acknowledged draining away. He wouldn't have to do it again. Wouldn't have to see another flash, another mushroom cloud, another city erased from existence. The third atomic bomb would never fall. Los Alamos, New Mexico, July 16, 1945, 0529, 45 hours. Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer watched through dark welding goggles as the world's first atomic bomb detonated in the New Mexico desert. The Trinity device sat atop a 100-foot steel tower in the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man, a desolate stretch of desert chosen specifically because nothing lived there that mattered. The flash lasted 2 seconds, brighter than 1,000 suns, visible 200 miles away. The light was wrong, not the yellow-white of normal explosions, but a searing purple-white that seemed to tear through reality itself. 10 miles away in the observation bunker, the heat was palpable through concrete walls. Oppenheimer's face, illuminated by the impossible light, showed something between awe and horror. Later, he would recall thinking of Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. But General Leslie Groves, military director of the Manhattan Project, standing beside Oppenheimer with binoculars pressed to his eyes, thought something entirely different. How many more can we build? How fast? Within 6 hours of the Trinity test, that question had preliminary answers. The plutonium implosion design worked. Production facilities at Hanford, Washington, could produce additional plutonium cores. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, was enriching uranium for simpler, gun-type bombs. The mathematics of atomic production in July 1945. One uranium bomb already assembled, Little Boy, destined for first combat use. One plutonium bomb ready, Fat Man, the second weapon. One additional plutonium core arriving mid-August, F-31. One more core following late August, F-32. Production ramping to 3 to 4 cores per month by fall 1945. Groves argued for maximum deployment speed. Each bomb cost approximately $2 billion in 1945 dollars, roughly $30 billion in modern currency. Each represented 130,000 workers across dozens of facilities. Each could potentially end the war weeks earlier, saving thousands of American lives in a planned invasion. His operational philosophy: use them as fast as production allows. No pauses, no hesitation, maximum pressure on Japan until unconditional surrender is achieved. President Harry S. Truman, in office less than 4 months since Roosevelt's death, received these recommendations while preparing for the Potsdam Conference. He had learned of the Manhattan Project's existence only after becoming president. Now he controlled weapons more powerful than anything in human history. The question was never whether to use atomic bombs. Germany had surrendered in May, but Japan fought on. American casualty projections for invading the Japanese home islands ran to hundreds of thousands. The atomic bomb offered a way to end the war without invasion. The question was, when do we stop using them? Potsdam, Germany, July 24, 1945. Truman met with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin to negotiate post-war arrangements. On July 24th, after receiving confirmation that Trinity had succeeded, Truman casually mentioned to Stalin that America possessed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin's reaction was studied, carefully neutral. What Truman didn't know, Soviet intelligence had penetrated the Manhattan Project. Stalin knew about atomic bombs. He knew their approximate capabilities. He was already directing Soviet scientists to develop their own. 2 days later, the Potsdam Declaration issued to Japan. Immediate unconditional surrender or face prompt and utter destruction. Japan's military government did not respond. The atomic missions were authorized. August 6, 1945. Hiroshima, 08:15 local time. Colonel Paul Tibbets piloted the Enola Gay at 31,000 feet over Hiroshima, a city of 350,000 people that had been deliberately spared from conventional bombing to preserve it as a pristine target for atomic weapons assessment. Bombardier Major Thomas Farabee centered the crosshairs on the Ioi Bridge in central Hiroshima. At 08:15:17, he released Little Boy, a uranium gun-type bomb, 9,700 pounds, containing 141 pounds of uranium-235. The bomb fell for 43 seconds. At 8:1600, at 1,900 feet above the city, Little Boy detonated with a yield of 15 kilotons, 15,000 tons of TNT equivalent released in a microsecond. The fireball reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Everything within 1,000 feet of ground zero vaporized instantly. The blast wave traveled outward at 700 miles per hour, collapsing buildings for 2 miles. A firestorm ignited, consuming everything combustible within the blast radius. Immediate deaths, 70,000 to 80,000. By December 1945, approximately 140,000 dead from burns, injuries, and radiation poisoning. Truman's statement that day: "If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth." The implicit message: we have more bombs. We will use them. Surrender now or face continued destruction. Japan's Supreme War Council met in emergency session. Military hardliners insisted the atomic bomb was a one-time weapon, possibly America's only example. They argued for continued resistance. Japan did not surrender. August 9, 1945. Nagasaki, 11:02 local time. The second atomic mission's primary target was Kokura, a city with major military arsenals. But smoke from previous conventional bombing obscured the target. After 3 passes without clear visual confirmation, Major Charles Sweeney, piloting boxcar with the Fat Man plutonium bomb, diverted to the secondary target, Nagasaki. Nagasaki was not a pristine target. Conventional bombing had already struck the city. The terrain, steep valleys surrounded by hills, made it less ideal for atomic weapons effects assessment, but fuel was critical. Boxcar's fuel pumps had malfunctioned, leaving 600 gallons trapped and unusable. Sweeney had fuel for 1 bombing run, no more. At 11:02 local time, Bombardier Captain Kermit Behan released Fat Man through a brief gap in the clouds. The plutonium implosion bomb, 10,300 pounds, 13.6 pounds of plutonium, detonated at 1,650 feet over the Urakami Valley, with a yield of 21 kilotons. The valley's terrain contained the blast somewhat, but the destruction was still catastrophic. The industrial district and residential areas in the valley were obliterated. Immediate deaths, 40,000 to 75,000. Total deaths by end of 1945, approximately 70,000. Still, Japan did not surrender immediately. The Supreme War Council remained deadlocked. Emperor Hirohito had not yet made his decision. Military hardliners argued that 2 bombs proved America's limited capacity. Perhaps they only had 2. Perhaps continued resistance would force negotiated peace rather than unconditional surrender. They didn't know about F-31, already being prepared on Tinian Island. They didn't know about F-32, days behind it. They didn't know about the production pipeline that could deliver 3 to 4 bombs per month by fall. But American military planners knew, and they were preparing the 3rd atomic mission. Tinian Island, August 10th to 16th, 1945. The tense week. The F-31 plutonium core arrived on Tinian aboard a C-54 transport on August 14th. 2 Los Alamos scientists accompanied the core in a specialized transport container during the entire flight from New Mexico. The container was cylindrical, 12 inches tall, surprisingly small for something so consequential. Inside, 13.6 pounds of plutonium-239, refined at Hanford, machined into a sphere at Los Alamos. The metal was warm to the touch. Plutonium's radioactive decay generates heat, not metaphorically warm, literally warm, like a living thing. The scientists transferred the core under armed guard to the Weapons Assembly Building, a heavily guarded, climate-controlled facility where atomic bombs were assembled from their component parts. Assembly of a Fat Man-type bomb required 3 to 4 days. Install the plutonium core in the center of the implosion assembly. Surround it with 32 explosive lenses arranged in precise geometric configuration. Wire 64 detonators that must fire within microseconds of each other. Install firing circuits, arming mechanisms, and barometric triggers. Test all systems without actually arming the weapon. Load into B-29 bomb bay with specialized handling equipment. By August 17th, F-31 would be ready for combat use. Target selection was already complete. Tokyo. Specifically the Imperial Palace in Government District in central Tokyo. Not an industrial target like Hiroshima's Army Depot or Nagasaki's Mitsubishi facilities. The capital itself. The symbolic and actual heart of Japanese government. The rationale? Demonstrate that America could and would strike anywhere, including the most protected and symbolic location in Japan. Prove that resistance was futile. Force unconditional surrender through overwhelming psychological impact. But during this week, Japan's situation was evolving rapidly in ways that American intelligence could only partially track. Tokyo, Imperial Palace, August 10th, 1945, 0200 hours. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo studied the reconnaissance photographs spread across the conference table in the underground bunker beneath the Imperial Palace. Hiroshima, the center of the city simply gone, replaced by a black scar. Nagasaki, the Urakami Valley scorched to bare earth. War Minister General Korochika Anami stood across the table, arms crossed. He had argued for continued resistance for hours. His position: the Americans probably possessed only 2 or 3 atomic bombs. Japan could endure. American invasion of the home islands would be so costly that the United States would negotiate conditional peace rather than demand unconditional surrender and occupation. Togo responded with quiet intensity. If they have 2 bombs, they can have 10. If they have 10, they can produce 100. The question is not how many atomic bombs the Americans possess. The question is how many Japanese cities must disappear before we accept reality. Anami's face hardened, but he said nothing. The military logic that had sustained Japan's war effort for 4 years was collapsing. You cannot fight an enemy who can erase your cities without risking their own forces. You cannot defend against weapons that travel at 600 miles per hour and explode with the force of 20,000 tons of explosives. The Supreme War Council, 6 men who made Japan's most critical decisions, remained deadlocked at 3-3. Military hardliners, Anami, Army Chief Umezu, Navy Chief Toyota, versus peace advocates, Togo, Navy Minister Yonai, Prime Minister Suzuki. Only Emperor Hirohito could break the deadlock, and Hirohito, who had remained largely silent throughout the war, was finally ready to speak. At 2:30 hours, the emperor entered the conference room. All stood and bowed. Hirohito, normally reserved to the point of inscrutability, spoke with clear determination. The war must end. The Potsdam Declaration terms must be accepted, with one condition: preservation of the imperial institution and the emperor's position. At 7 o'clock hours on August 10th, Japan transmitted this conditional surrender offer through Swiss diplomatic channels. Washington, D.C., August 10th, 1945. Truman received Japan's conditional surrender offer in the afternoon. His cabinet debated the response intensely. Secretary of State James Burns argued for rejecting any conditions. The Potsdam Declaration demanded unconditional surrender. Accepting conditions would undermine American credibility and might encourage Japan to seek further concessions. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who had initially supported atomic weapons use, now advocated for pragmatic flexibility. The emperor's continuation under Allied authority was effectively unconditional surrender with face-saving language. Rejecting it would prolong the war unnecessarily and potentially require additional atomic bombings or invasion. Truman crafted the American response personally, threading between absolute and conditional. From the moment of surrender, the authority of the emperor and the Japanese government to rule, the state shall be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers. The language was deliberately ambiguous. Japan could interpret it as preserving the emperor's position. America could interpret it as subordinating the emperor to American military authority, functionally unconditional. The response was transmitted on August 11th, and the F-31 Corps sat on Tinian, being prepared for final assembly. Tokyo, August 12th to 14th, the final crisis. Japan's Supreme War Council met in continuous session to debate the American response. The ambiguous language about the emperor's status allowed for conflicting interpretations. Military hardliners insisted, the emperor's position is preserved. We have achieved our one essential condition. This represents success, not surrender. Peace advocates countered, the emperor's authority is subordinate to Allied command. This is unconditional surrender with minimal face-saving language, accepted immediately before more cities are destroyed. While this debate raged, the Soviet Union, having entered the war against Japan on August 9th, was rapidly advancing into Manchuria and Korea. Soviet forces were destroying Japanese armies in the north with shocking speed. Japan now faced enemies on all sides, with no possibility of negotiated peace with one power against another. The psychological impact of Soviet entry may have been as significant as the atomic bombs. For months, Japan had hoped the Soviet Union might mediate a negotiated peace. That hope evaporated on August 9th. By August 14th, Emperor Hirohito made his final decision: accept the Allied terms. Prepare a recorded message announcing surrender to be broadcast on August 15th. But not everyone in the military accepted this decision. The coup attempt. Night of August 14th to 15th, 1945. A group of army officers led by Major Kenji Hatanaka and Lieutenant Colonel Masataka Ida attempted to prevent the surrender by force. Their plan: seize the imperial palace, locate and destroy the emperor's recorded surrender message, place Hirohito under protective custody, issue orders in the emperor's name continuing the war, rally loyal military units to support continued resistance. The coup nearly succeeded. The plotters gained control of the palace grounds, isolated the emperor's chambers, and searched frantically for the recordings, but they failed to find them. The records were hidden in a basement safe in the empress's quarters, a location the plotters didn't search. By dawn on August 15th, senior officers loyal to the emperor suppressed the coup. The leaders were arrested or committed suicide. War Minister Anami, who had known about the plot but neither supported nor opposed it, committed ritual suicide by seppuku at his home on the morning of August 15th. His final statement, written before his death: "Believing firmly that our sacred land shall never perish, I, with my death, humbly apologize to the emperor for the great crime." The coup's failure ensured the surrender would proceed. But if the coup had succeeded, the war would have continued, and the third atomic bomb would almost certainly have been used. On Tinian Island, assembly of F-31 continued through August 14th. The mission was still scheduled for August 19th or 20th, depending on final weather assessment. Target: Tokyo Imperial Palace and Government District. The atomic bomb that would kill the plotters, the emperor, and hundreds of thousands of civilians, sat ready in its weapons assembly building, awaiting only final orders to load it aboard Major Sweeney's B-29. August 15th, 1945, noon, Tokyo time. Emperor Hirohito's voice was broadcast via radio throughout Japan for the first time in history. His speech used formal, archaic Japanese that many common citizens struggled to understand, but the essential message was clear. The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. Should we continue to fight, it would not only result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. How are we to save the millions of our subjects, or to atone ourselves before the hallowed spirits of our imperial ancestors? This is the reason why we have ordered the acceptance of the provisions of the Joint Declaration of the Powers. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The third atomic bomb was no longer needed. Or was it? Tinian Island, August 15th to 17th, 1945. Even after Hirohito's surrender broadcast, the F-31 Corps remained on Tinian in its assembly building, with work continuing on the bomb's construction. General Carl Spaatz, commanding U.S. strategic air forces in the Pacific, sent an encrypted message to the War Department in Washington on August 15th. Japan's surrender announcement received and confirmed. Request immediate clarification on status of third atomic mission. F-31 Corps on Tinian. Bomb assembly 80% complete. Weapon can be operational within 48 hours. Aircrew briefed and ready, awaiting explicit orders. The request was legitimate from a military perspective. Japan had announced surrender, but several critical uncertainties remained. Formal surrender documents were not yet signed. Some Japanese military units in outlying territories continued fighting, either unaware of surrender or refusing to accept it. The Soviet Union's rapid advance into Japanese-held territory created complex political situations. Trust in Japan's commitment to unconditional surrender remained uncertain. Would the terms be honored fully? Some military planners argued for maintaining the third bomb in ready status as insurance. If Japan wavered, if surrender terms weren't honored, if the military hardliners who attempted the coup tried again, the third weapon could be deployed within 24 hours. General Leslie Groves advocated strongly for this position. His argument: keep F-31 ready, but don't use it unless Japan backtracks. Demonstrate continued capability and resolve. Make clear that America's atomic production is continuing and that surrender is the only option. But Truman was already moving toward a different decision: the calculation. Between August 15th and 17th, Truman consulted with his senior advisors about the third atomic mission. The debate revealed fundamental questions about nuclear weapons that would echo through the next 8 decades. Military perspective: General Groves, General Spaatz, some Pentagon planners. Keep F-31 ready as insurance policy. Surrender is not final until signed. Demonstration of continued atomic capability maintains pressure. Investment of $2 billion per bomb demands maximum utilization. Diplomatic perspective: Secretary of State Burns, State Department. Japan has clearly surrendered. Using third bomb after surrender would damage American diplomatic standing. Soviet Union would use excessive atomic bombing for propaganda purposes. Post-war international order requires American moral authority. Moral perspective: Secretary of War Stimson, some religious leaders, scientists. 2 bombs accomplish their purpose. Third bombing after surrender indication would be vengeance, not military necessity. sets dangerous precedent for unlimited nuclear use, undermines effort to establish international atomic energy control. Strategic perspective, some military planners, emerging Cold War thinkers. Restraint in victory demonstrates strength, not weakness. Nuclear weapons should be weapons of last resort, not convenience. Establishing norms around nuclear use serves long-term American interests. Excessive use normalizes atomic warfare, increasing future risk. Truman weighed these arguments over 48 hours. His own thinking, recorded in diary entries and later memoirs, focused on a simple principle. Military necessity must justify atomic use. Once that necessity disappears, continued use becomes murder, not war. Japan had surrendered. Military necessity no longer existed. Therefore, the third bomb should not be used. August 17, 1945. 0600 hours. The order. President Truman's order reached Tinian via encrypted teletype at 0647 hours, Tinian time. Mission F-31 cancelled. Effective immediately. Disassemble weapon. Return core to secure storage for transport to Los Alamos. No further atomic weapons to be assembled or deployed without direct presidential authorized. Acknowledge receipt and compliance. General Spaatz acknowledged at 7:15 hours. By 8 o'clock hours, the cancellation order reached the 509 composite group and Major Sweeney's crew. The relief was profound and immediate. Sweeney later wrote in his memoirs, "I had flown Nagasaki. I had seen what these weapons do, not theoretically from scientific reports, but directly, viscerally. The thought of dropping a third on Tokyo, a city of millions, many of them women and children who had no voice in their government's decisions, had kept me awake every night since I learned I was scheduled for the mission. When the cancellation came, I felt a reprieve from something terrible. We had done what was necessary to end the war. We were not required to do more." The disassembly. August 18, 1945. Disassembling the F-31 bomb took 4 hours. It was the reverse of creation, performed by the same Los Alamos scientists who had assembled it. The process required extreme care. The explosive lenses surrounding the plutonium core, 32 precisely shaped blocks of conventional high explosive, had to be removed without detonating them. The 64 detonators had to be disconnected in proper sequence. The firing circuits had to be disabled. Finally, the plutonium core itself had to be extracted from the center of the implosion assembly. One of the scientists, whose name remains partially classified in declassified documents, later described the experience in a 1980s oral history interview. "We had assembled Little Boy for Hiroshima and Fat Man for Nagasaki. Both times, knowing our work would kill tens of thousands of people within hours was sobering, to say the least. But we told ourselves it was necessary to end the war and save lives. American lives, yes, but also Japanese lives that would be lost in an invasion or continued fighting. When we started assembling F-31, there was a different atmosphere in the assembly building. Japan was already discussing surrender. We were preparing to kill more people even though the war was effectively over. Some of us questioned whether we should refuse, but we were soldiers, following orders. When the cancellation order came, the relief was palpable. We had done enough. We didn't have to add to the toll." The plutonium core was removed from the implosion assembly at 14:30 hours on August 18th. It sat on a workbench in the secure facility, a sphere of gleaming silver-gray metal, slightly warm to the touch from radioactive decay, 13.6 pounds of refined plutonium that would never kill anyone. The scientists placed it carefully in the specialized transport container, locked it, tagged it, F-31, returned to CONUS, non-combat use only. The bomb that would never fall was going home. The fourth core. The F-32 plutonium core arrived on Tinian on August 24th, over a week after Japan's formal surrender ceremony aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd. It was never assembled into a weapon. It was immediately placed in secure storage and returned to Los Alamos on the same transport that carried F-31. Both cores were eventually used in post-war nuclear testing programs. Operation Crossroads at Bikini Atoll in 1946, and subsequent tests in the Nevada desert. They detonated over empty ocean and uninhabited desert, contributing to scientific understanding of nuclear weapons effects. But they killed no one. Their explosions ended no lives. The distinction between F-31's fate and what it was designed for is stark. Instead of obliterating Tokyo's city center and killing perhaps 100,000 to 200,000 people instantly, it detonated over empty Pacific water, observed by scientists and military personnel at safe distances, contributing data to weapons development and military doctrine. Whether this was a better or worse use of $2 billion and 13.6 pounds of plutonium is a question each person must answer individually. The decision that shaped nuclear history. Truman's decision to cancel the third atomic mission, despite having the weapon ready and available, established precedents that influenced nuclear strategy and international relations for the next 8 decades. These precedents were not immediately recognized as such. In August 1945, most observers simply saw a practical decision. Japan surrendered, so further bombing was unnecessary. The deeper implications emerged over the following years and decades as nuclear weapons proliferated and Cold War tensions developed. Precedent 1. Nuclear weapons require presidential authorization. By asserting direct presidential control over the third bomb, Truman established that nuclear weapons were not simply more powerful conventional weapons to be employed at the discretion of field commanders. The August 17th order explicitly stated, "No further atomic weapons to be assembled or deployed without direct presidential authorization." This created institutional structures and decision-making protocols that persist today. Nuclear weapons launch codes, nuclear football, remain with the president at all times. Release of nuclear weapons requires explicit presidential authorization. Field commanders cannot employ nuclear weapons on their own authority, regardless of tactical situation. Peacetime movement and deployment of nuclear weapons requires presidential approval. During the Cold War, this precedent prevented several dangerous situations where field commanders or strategic planners advocated nuclear use. Korea, 1950. General Douglas MacArthur requested authorization to use atomic bombs against Chinese forces. President Truman refused. MacArthur's public disagreement led to his dismissal. The precedent held, military commanders do not decide nuclear use. Cuba, 1962. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, some military advisors advocated preemptive nuclear strikes against Soviet missile sites. President Kennedy maintained exclusive control over any decision to use nuclear weapons. The restraint established in 1945 influenced decision-making in 1962. Vietnam, 1960s. Various proposals for tactical nuclear weapons use in Vietnam were rejected at presidential level. The requirement for presidential authorization created an institutional barrier against casual nuclear use. Without the precedent established by canceling the third bomb, asserting that nuclear use requires presidential decision based on specific political and military necessity, nuclear weapons might have been treated as conventional weapons available to field commanders. The history of the past 79 years might have been very different and far more dangerous. Precedent 2. Restraint demonstrates strength, not weakness. The decision to stop at 2 bombs when a third was available demonstrated that restraint with weapons of mass destruction is a mark of responsible power, not weakness or indecision. This was not obvious in August 1945. Some military planners argued that failing to use available atomic weapons would signal American weakness and might encourage Japanese military hardliners to continue resistance. But Truman's calculation proved correct. Japan surrendered unconditionally. The restraint did not undermine American position, but actually strengthened it by demonstrating that the United States was a responsible power that used overwhelming force only when militarily necessary. This precedent influenced American strategic posture throughout the Cold War. Deterrence doctrine. American nuclear strategy emphasized deterrence, convincing adversaries not to attack rather than warfighting. Restraint in actual use enhanced credibility of deterrence. If nuclear weapons were used casually, deterrence threats would be less credible. No first-use debates. Throughout the Cold War, the United States maintained deliberate ambiguity about whether it would use nuclear weapons first in a conflict. But the baseline assumption, established in 1945, was that nuclear use required extraordinary justification. Arms control. American efforts to negotiate arms control agreements, from the 1963 Limited Test Ban Treaty through the 1987 INF Treaty to modern non-proliferation efforts, were grounded in the principle that nuclear restraint serves national interests. If the United States had used 3 atomic bombs in 1945, including one after surrender was clearly imminent, the international perception of American nuclear doctrine would have been fundamentally different. Adversaries might have concluded that the U.S. would use nuclear weapons readily, possibly requiring preemptive strikes during crises. Allies might have questioned American judgment and moral authority. Precedent 3. The nuclear taboo. The decision to limit atomic use to 2 weapons, employed in circumstances of clear military necessity, began what international relations scholars call the nuclear taboo, a powerful international norm against nuclear weapons use. From August 9, 1945, to the present day, 79 years as of 2024, nuclear weapons have not been used in warfare. This is the longest period of non-use for any major weapon system in history. Artillery, tanks, aircraft, missiles, all have been used repeatedly in conflicts large and small. Only nuclear weapons remain unused. This abstinence is not guaranteed by physics or law. It's sustained by a powerful normative taboo that makes nuclear use almost unthinkable, except in the most extreme circumstances. The taboo began in August 1945. If the United States had used 3, 4, or 5 atomic bombs, casually without clear necessity once surrender was imminent, nuclear use might have become normalized. Future conflicts might have seen more casual consideration of nuclear options. Instead, the decision to stop at 2 established that nuclear weapons are special, different, requiring extraordinary justification. Evidence of the taboo's strength: Korean War. Despite Chinese intervention and military setbacks, no nuclear weapons used. Vietnam War. Despite prolonged conflict and military frustration, no nuclear weapons used. Middle East conflicts. Despite possession by multiple regional powers, no nuclear weapons used. India-Pakistan conflicts. Despite 4 wars and ongoing tensions between nuclear-armed rivals, no nuclear weapons used. Numerous Cold War crises, Berlin crises, Cuban Missile Crisis, Middle East tensions, all resolved without nuclear use despite weapons being ready and available. This 79-year record of non-use is remarkable and not inevitable. The taboo could break, but it has held longer than most expected in 1945, in part because the precedent established then, that nuclear weapons are weapons of absolute last resort, created strong normative constraints against their use. The alternative history. What if Truman had authorized the third atomic mission despite Japan's surrender indication? Military historians have extensively examined this counterfactual scenario. Immediate effects. Tokyo would have been bombed on August 19th or 20th, 1945. Estimated casualties: 100,000 to 200,000 immediate deaths. Possible death of Emperor Hirohito if Imperial Palace hit directly. Destruction of Japanese government infrastructure. Strategic effects. Surrender would likely have proceeded anyway. Japan had already decided. No military advantage gained beyond what 2 bombs achieved. Potential complications with Soviet forces advancing into Japan. American forces would have needed to establish occupation over more devastated territory. International political effects. Severe criticism from allies, especially Britain and Canada. Soviet propaganda windfall about American brutality and disregard for human life. Damage to American moral authority in establishing post-war international order. Complications in founding United Nations and other international institutions. Long-term nuclear effects. Normalization of nuclear use. Weapons employed because available, not because necessary. Weaker nuclear taboo, making Cold War nuclear use more likely. Soviet leaders might conclude U.S. would use nuclear weapons readily, increasing crisis instability. Pressure for preemptive nuclear strategies during Cold War crises. Weaker non-proliferation norms and arms control regime. The decision to cancel the third mission may have saved not just 100,000 to 200,000 lives in August 1945, but countless lives over the following decades by establishing norms and precedents that made nuclear war less likely. What happened to the cores? The F-31 and F-32 plutonium cores were returned to Los Alamos in September 1945. Neither was wasted. Plutonium was far too difficult and expensive to produce, to simply store indefinitely. Both cores were eventually used in Operation Crossroads, the post-war nuclear testing series conducted at Bikini Atoll in July 1946. Crossroads was designed to assess nuclear weapons effects on naval vessels and develop military doctrine for atomic warfare. 2 tests were conducted. Test Able, July 1, 1946. An atomic bomb was dropped from a B-29 over a fleet of 95 target vessels anchored in Bikini Lagoon. The bomb missed its target point by 650 yards, but still sank 5 ships and heavily damaged 14 others. Test Baker, July 25, 1946. An atomic bomb was detonated 90 feet underwater, creating a massive water column and base surge that contaminated the target fleet with radioactive water and sediment. One or both of the F-31 and F-32 cores were used in these tests. Declassified documents don't specify which core was used in which test, but both cores detonated over empty ocean rather than inhabited cities. So the plutonium that might have killed 100,000 to 200,000 people in Tokyo instead contributed to scientific understanding of nuclear weapons and naval warfare doctrine. Whether this represents redemption, waste, or simply pragmatic use of expensive materials is a question without clear answer. The men who almost flew. Major Charles Sweeney continued his Air Force career after the war. He rose to Major General before retiring in 1976. He became an advocate for nuclear arms control while defending the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings as militarily necessary and morally justified to end the war. In his 1997 memoir, War's End, Sweeney wrote extensively about the third mission that never happened. "I would have flown that mission if ordered. I was a soldier. Orders were orders. But I'm grateful I never had to. 2 atomic bombs ended the war. A third would have been vengeance, not victory. It would have crossed a line from military necessity to murder. I'm glad President Truman recognized that line and chose not to cross it." Sweeney died in 2004 at age 84, one of the last surviving atomic mission commanders. Colonel Paul Tibbets, who piloted the Enola Gay over Hiroshima, never expressed public regret for his role. In multiple interviews over 6 decades, his position remained consistent. The atomic bombings were necessary to end the war and save lives, both American and Japanese, that would have been lost in continued fighting or invasion. In a 2005 interview, shortly before his death, Tibbets reflected on the third bomb. "I knew when we took off on August 6 that this weapon would end the war. I felt no remorse then, and I feel no remorse now. But I'm glad we only had to use 2. That was enough. Using a third after Japan was ready to surrender would have been different. That would have been harder to justify." Tibbets died in 2007 at age 92, having lived with his role in history for 62 years without public regret, but also without celebration. The other crew members selected for the third mission, bombardier, navigator, flight engineer, gunners, returned to civilian life after the war. Most rarely spoke publicly about their roles in the atomic program. Several declined interview requests from historians over the years. One unnamed crew member, interviewed in the 1990s under condition of anonymity, reflected, "We trained for months to deliver these weapons. We were the best of the best, selected for precision, reliability, discipline. When they assigned me to the third mission, I was proud. This was important. Then I started thinking about it. Tokyo, millions of people, women, children, the emperor. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we knew what these weapons did. Not just numbers, but actual human beings burned, crushed, poisoned by radiation. The idea of doing it a third time, to the capital, after Japan was already talking surrender, it ate at me. When the cancellation came, I felt relief so profound I can barely describe it. We had done something terrible and necessary. We were being told we didn't have to do it again. That felt like grace." J. Robert Oppenheimer, the haunted creator. Oppenheimer, who directed the scientific effort to create atomic bombs, became increasingly troubled by nuclear weapons in the post-war years. He advocated for international control of atomic energy, opposed development of the hydrogen bomb, and eventually had his security clearance revoked in 1954 in a controversial hearing that many historians view as politically motivated punishment for his positions on nuclear policy. In a 1965 interview, Oppenheimer reflected on the third bomb. "When I learned that a third bomb was canceled, I felt, relief is inadequate. We had created these weapons because we feared Germany would create them first. Then Germany surrendered before we finished, but the project continued toward Japan. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we stood at a crossroads. We could go one of 2 ways. Nuclear weapons become normalized, just another tool of warfare, or they become special, horrible, to be avoided except in extremis. Truman's decision to stop at 2 pushed us toward the second path. The restraint wasn't complete. We still built thousands more weapons, enough to destroy civilization many times over. But the taboo against actually using them held. I'm grateful for that, though I know the two we did use caused terrible suffering. Oppenheimer died in 1967, never fully reconciled to his role as father of the atomic bomb. The Japanese perspective. The question of whether a third atomic bombing would have occurred had Japan not surrendered remains hypothetical. But Japanese historians and survivors have reflected extensively on how close their nation came to further atomic destruction. Tsutomu Yamaguchi, one of the few people to survive both Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombings, spoke in later life about learning that a third bomb had been prepared. "I was in Hiroshima on business on August 6th. The bomb exploded less than 3 kilometers from where I stood. I was badly burned, but survived. I returned to my home in Nagasaki on August 8th. The next day, August 9th, I was describing what I saw in Hiroshima to my supervisor at work when the second bomb exploded over Nagasaki. Again, I survived, though I was less than 3 kilometers from the explosion. Years later, I learned there was a third bomb ready. If my country had not surrendered, if that bomb had fallen on Tokyo or another city, how many more people would have experienced what I experienced twice? How many more would not have survived even once? I am grateful my leaders finally made the decision to end the war when they did." Yamaguchi became an advocate for nuclear disarmament before his death in 2010 at age 93, one of the last living people to survive 2 atomic bombings. The moral question that remains. The third atomic bomb raises a moral question that remains relevant 8 decades later. What obligations do we have to exercise restraint with overwhelming power? The United States in August 1945 possessed a weapon of unprecedented destructive power. No other nation could stop America from using it. No international law prohibited it. Military victory seemed to justify any means necessary, but Truman chose restraint. Once military necessity disappeared with Japan's surrender, he chose not to use the available weapon. This decision established that even in total war, even with enemies who themselves showed little restraint, even with weapons that could guarantee victory, there are limits. There are lines that should not be crossed once the reason for crossing them disappears. Whether this restraint was sufficient, whether 2 atomic bombs were themselves justified, or whether any use was moral, remains debated by historians, ethicists, and survivors. But the decision to stop at 2, when 3 or more were possible, established that somewhere there must be limits to violence, even in war. That principle remains urgently relevant in a world where 9 nations possess over 12,000 nuclear warheads, many hundreds of times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Japan. Nuclear weapons today, 2025. As of 2025, 9 nations possess nuclear weapons. United States, approximately 5,400 warheads, 1,670 deployed. Russia, approximately 5,900 warheads, 1,710 deployed. China, approximately 410 warheads. France, approximately 290 warheads. United Kingdom, approximately 225 warheads. Pakistan, approximately 170 warheads. India, approximately 164 warheads. Israel, approximately 90 warheads, unacknowledged. North Korea, approximately 30 to 40 warheads. Total global stockpile, approximately 12,500 nuclear warheads. Of these, approximately 3,700 are deployed on missiles or at bomber bases, ready for rapid use. The destructive power of modern nuclear arsenals dwarfs the weapons used in 1945. Little Boy, Hiroshima, had a yield of 15 kilotons. Modern strategic warheads have yields from 100 to 1,200 kilotons, up to 80 times more powerful. Thermonuclear weapons can exceed 5,000 kilotons, 5 megatons. One modern nuclear submarine carries enough destructive power to destroy dozens of cities. One strategic bomber can deliver weapons exceeding the combined yield of all explosives used in World War II. Yet for 79 years, no nuclear weapon has been used in warfare. The taboo holds. Close calls, when the taboo almost broke. The nuclear taboo has been tested repeatedly during the past 8 decades. Several times, nuclear use came frighteningly close. Korean War, 1950 to 1953. General MacArthur advocated for using atomic bombs against Chinese supply lines. President Truman refused. The precedent of presidential control and requirement for clear military necessity prevented escalation. Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962. During the most dangerous nuclear crisis in history, both American and Soviet forces came close to nuclear use. American destroyers dropped practice depth charges near Soviet submarines, not knowing the submarines carried nuclear-tipped torpedoes. Submarine commanders came within minutes of firing. Soviet commanders in Cuba had tactical nuclear weapons and authority to use them if invaded. President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev both exercised restraint at critical moments. The taboo held. 1983, Soviet false alarm. Soviet early warning systems falsely indicated incoming American missiles. Soviet duty officer Stanislav Petrov, suspecting a malfunction, did not report the alarm up the chain of command, preventing possible retaliation. The taboo, the assumption that nuclear war was too terrible to initiate except in genuine crisis, influenced his decision. Each time the norm established in 1945 that nuclear use requires extraordinary justification and should be avoided if possible, influenced decision-makers toward restraint. The fragility of the taboo. The nuclear taboo is not guaranteed to hold forever. It is sustained by continued recognition that nuclear weapons are uniquely destructive, institutional structures requiring high-level authorization for use, international norms and treaties stigmatizing nuclear use, deterrence relationships that make first use appear irrational, historical memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But these factors could erode. Several trends threaten the taboo. Passing of historical memory. As survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki die, direct testimony about nuclear weapons effects diminishes. Younger generations may view nuclear weapons more abstractly. Development of tactical nuclear weapons. Smaller yield weapons designed for battlefield use might blur the line between conventional and nuclear weapons, making use more thinkable. Cyber and space weapons. New weapon systems that could destroy early warning systems or command and control might create use it or lose it pressures during crises. Proliferation. As more nations acquire nuclear weapons, probability of use by accident, miscalculation, or rogue actors increases. Climate change and resource scarcity. Future conflicts over water, food, and habitable territory might create pressures that override traditional restraints. The taboo that has held for 79 years is not inevitable. It requires continued reinforcement and vigilance. What the third bomb teaches us. The story of the third atomic bomb, the weapon we chose not to use, offers lessons for managing nuclear dangers today. Lesson 1. Restraint is strength. Choosing not to use available, overwhelming force, when that force is no longer necessary, demonstrates responsible power. This lesson applies to modern nuclear policy. Maintaining weapons for deterrence while exercising maximum restraint in actual use enhances rather than undermines security. Lesson 2. Decisions made in crisis shape future decades. Truman's decision in August 1945 influenced nuclear policy for 8 decades. Current decisions about nuclear posture, arms control, and crisis management will shape the next 8 decades. Lesson 3. Norms matter. The nuclear taboo is not a law or treaty, but a powerful social norm. Maintaining and strengthening that norm requires conscious effort by governments, militaries, and civil society. Lesson 4. Technology demands wisdom. Creating weapons of enormous destructive power is relatively easy. Using them wisely, or choosing not to use them, requires wisdom and moral courage. Lesson 5. We can change course. The trajectory from building atomic bombs to using them seemed inevitable in 1945, but Truman chose to stop it too. We are not prisoners of technological momentum or historical inevitability. Choices matter. The unanswered question. The third atomic bomb raises a question that humanity has not yet definitively answered. Can a species that has created weapons capable of destroying itself learn the wisdom to never use them? For 79 years, the answer has been yes. 9 nations possess nuclear weapons. None have used them. The taboo holds. But the question remains open. Every generation must answer it anew through their decisions, their restraint, and their commitment to ensuring that the weapons created in 1945 never again fall on cities. The third atomic bomb that never fell reminds us that we can choose restraint. We can stop. We can say, enough. Whether we will continue choosing restraint is the question on which civilization may depend. Tinian Island, August 18, 1945, 1500 hours. The F-31 plutonium core sat in its transport container, locked and tagged for return to Los Alamos. The weapon that might have killed 100,000 to 200,000 people in Tokyo was now simply 13.6 pounds of radioactive metal destined for a storage vault. Major Charles Sweeney stood outside the weapons assembly building, watching technicians load the container onto a truck for transport to the airfield. In 3 days, it would be back in New Mexico, where it began. He pulled out a small notebook and wrote, not for any official report, but for himself. August 18, 1945. Today we disassembled what might have been the third atomic bomb. Relief, profound relief, but also a strange sense that we've crossed a threshold. We built these weapons. We used 2 of them. We chose not to use a third. That choice feels as important as the decision to use the first 2. We demonstrated that we can stop, that we can say, enough. I hope that lesson endures. I hope future generations remember not just the bombs we dropped, but the one we didn't drop. Sometimes what we choose not to do defines us as much as what we do. He closed the notebook and watched the truck drive away toward the airfield, carrying the weapon that would never fall. The arithmetic of restraint. 3 atomic bombs prepared, 2 used to end a war, 1 held back. Result? War ended without invasion. Precedent established. Nuclear weapons are special. Norm created. Restraint is strength. Taboo begun. 79 years without nuclear warfare. The third atomic bomb never fell. Its shadow influenced nuclear history for 8 decades. The lesson? Power without restraint is not strength, it's chaos. The most important decisions are sometimes about what we choose not to do, the weapons we choose not to use, the violence we choose not to inflict. President Truman had the third bomb. He had the authority. Japan was still technically at war. Military planners advocated for its use. He said no. That decision, to stop when stopping was possible, to exercise restraint when overwhelming force was available, to recognize when enough was enough, may have saved not just lives in August 1945, but countless lives in the decades since. The third atomic bomb that never fell may be as historically significant as the 2 that did. Sometimes the weapons we don't use are more important than the ones we do.